We have now been living through a pandemic for the past 2 years, and it made me think of other pandemic the world went through. I did a little bit of research and found a few, but the most devastating one was definitely the Black Death or the plague. Let's just look a little bit at how it happened, how it started, and how did people live through this time and the consequences it had. So there's still definitely some debate as far as where it originated from, but scientists definitely believe that it started somewhere in Asia. Nonetheless, one thing that is clear is when it got to Europe through Crimea in Eastern Europe, and that was in 1347. And it was probably carried by flea infested black rats in ship. In the day of October 1347, several ships filled with dead sailors and very ill one arrived in Crimea covered with black boils, oozing of blood and pus. Can you imagine how people felt and how scared they were when they saw all of the dead bodies and all of the sick sailors coming out of the ships? At the time, many Europeans had heard about what they called the Great Pestilence, but most of them didn't know what was to come, and they definitely didn't know that this disease will cause the death of one third of the continent population. The Black Death had devastating consequences, and it's estimated that 80 to 200 million people died between 1346 and 1353 in Europe, Asia, and North Africa. It's hard to have an exact number because of the fact that back in the days, there were not clear records of death. A lot of deaths were not recorded, especially because of the fact that so many people die. At some point, there definitely were no records, and it also is so long ago that a lot of record and documentation have also been lost through times. One thing that we definitely know is that the plague or Black Death was carried by rats, most precisely black rats, and those rats were being infected by fleas. There's still some debate about how the rat behaved when it came to the disease. There's some instances in India, for example, where people were saying that a lot of rats were dying. And then in Europe, there's no clear instance of rats dying, but one thing we know is the fleas probably didn't have enough rat to feed off, because that's literally what was happening. They would bite the rats and basically feed off the blood of the rat, but at some point they didn't have enough, and because rats were living in such proximity of human, they went basically from rats to human, and the fleas would carry the disease from the rat to the human, and that's how they started infecting humans. And there were three different types of plague: the bubonic plague, the septicemic plague, and the pneumonic plague. The bubonic plague killed 75% of people infected. The septicemic and the pneumonic plague killed 100% of people infected. This disease was ravaging the cities, ravaging the countries. People had no way to stop it. The bubonic plague had an incubation period of 2 to 8 days. And what happened is, after being bitten by the flea, the bacteria would just go directly and attack the lymphatic system. So what would happen is people would develop some buboes, which basically were the lymph nodes becoming painful and growing. Sometimes the nodes would grow as big as lemon and sometimes apples. On top of that, people would develop fever, headache, chills, and weakness. When it comes to the septicemic plague, we're not really sure about the incubation period. All we know is probably around a few days. It also caused similar symptoms: fever, chill, extreme weakness, but on top of that, it also caused abdominal pain, shock, and bleeding into the skin and other organs. The septicemic plague was brutal. It will cause your skin and other tissues to turn black and die, especially the fingers, toes, and nose. The most common plague was the bubonic plague, but sometimes untreated bubonic plague could become a septicemic plague, but sometimes it could also become pneumonic plague. The pneumonic plague incubation period was 1 to 3 days. It also caused fever, headache, and weakness, but on top of it, it will also cause pneumonia, shortness of breath, chest pain, cough with bloody and watery mucus. The pneumonic plague was very infectious, because it could be transferred through droplet, basically through coughing and sneezing. It would also develop from untreated bubonic plague or septicemic plague. It was definitely a very serious form of the plague because it could spread from one person to another, when most of the other form of plague were usually directly given to human through bites from fleas. The main issue at the time was definitely lack of hygiene. Most of the population was living in very poor condition, and with lack of hygiene, lack of access to clean water, and no plumbing at the time, it was way easier for diseases and bacteria to spread, especially through insects and rodents like rats. Rats were living at close proximities, and the way houses were built, a lot of people had one-story homes, and a lot of rats would live and make their nest just above the main room, around an area that would be like the ceiling today, and the fleas would basically drop from the ceiling to the people living in the house, and from there they would easily have access to them and bite them. Richer people had two-story home. They also lived in more spacious environment, and houses were not necessarily as close as one another, so it made it a little bit easier for them to not have rats and to not be as easily accessible to fleas, but they still also were highly affected by the disease. At the time though, people did not fully understand the disease and its transmission, including doctors. Doctors had really restricted knowledge of medicine, of how diseases were transmitted, especially through fleas, and there were a lot of beliefs about different things. People attributed the plague to many things, but two of the main things were the wrath of God and bad air. The concept of bad air was really common at the time, and a lot of people believed that diseases would be transmitted through the air, especially through bad smells. Because of this, it was extremely difficult to find cures, but doctors tried many different types of techniques. Some of those techniques were used for many other different types of diseases, and they were applied to the plague. Animals were regularly used to try to cure diseases. Snakes, chicken, and many more animals were used. One example of using an animal to cure disease, in the case of the chicken, would be to use a healthy chicken, remove feathers from one side of the chicken, and then use the bare part of the chicken with the chicken alive and apply it to the swollen nodes of the sick person. When the chicken starts to show signs of the disease, it was believed that the chicken was basically drawing the illness away from the sick person, and this will be done until the chicken or the sick person dies. Medieval medical remedies. And that's not the only one. They also were using a lot of different types of potions. Many of these potions were just too expensive for most people. Some of them were made out of crushed emerald, and people would drink them. Rich people, they would also drink arsenic or mercury, and many other different types of potion. Fumigation was also another way to cure diseases. They would fumigate houses and different areas with incense, and that was one way for them to clean the bad air and stop diseases from spreading. People will also carry bouquet of flowers or hold them to their faces to fumigate their lungs. But it was also used, hold on, because that one is a hard one, but it was also used to cover the stench of decomposing bodies, because so many people died that it got to a point where the streets were filled with bodies, and it would take so long to take the bodies, and there were no more spaces to bury everybody. So by the time bodies were removed from the street, a lot of them were already decomposing, and the side of the street were extremely difficult, but also there was an extremely strong odor in the street, and people would use those bouquets as a way to cover the smell, and they also believed that it would protect them from getting sick. One really common technique also was called bloodletting, and it was a popular remedy. People believed that bad blood caused diseases. So one way to cure a disease would be to let the bad blood go. But that would require to remove that blood from the body. Rich people would usually use leeches And there were actually people called leech collector, and they were highly paid to bring great quality leeches that they would put on people's body to suck the bad blood out of them. But those were way too expensive for most of the population. So other people would just make incision on their skin and let go of the blood in a cup. You can also imagine that this will be because of infection. Another cause of infection was the fact that they were also using different type of pastes, and a lot of those pastes were made out of roots, herbs, and flour, but other were actually made of urine and feces, and those were being applied to the buboes or different other part of the bodies. So some of those techniques, instead of improving the state of the sick, they were actually making the situation worse without even knowing. A lot of rich people overall just decided to flee the cities. Highly infected areas, which were usually in cities, and go to the countryside where they would just hang out together and tell each other stories to pass the time. One extreme consequence of the disease was also the persecution of marginalized communities. Unfortunately, like in a lot of cases, humans always try to blame others or find a cause to something that is unexplainable to them, and they would always go into minorities or marginalized communities. At the time, gypsies, Jews were most of the time considered different from the people, and they would regularly be accused of a lot of issues in society. In that case, a lot of Jews were being accused of poisoning the well. A lot of them were being threatened regularly, even tortured, to confess that they actually poisoned the well. The torture was so brutal that a lot of them confessed even though they hadn't done anything, and that would lead to the death penalty. And at the medieval time, people were brutal. Most of them were literally burned alive on the public space as punishment for causing the disease. Many Jews had to flee several cities. One of the only places that accepted them and actually protected them was Poland, which is one of the reasons why there was a high concentration of Jews in Poland, which unfortunately later made them an easier target for Hitler. If you are interested, we can discuss that in a separate video. Let me know in the comment below. We'll just stop here today for the part 1 on the plague. Let's come back next week to discuss more remedies or techniques used to protect the population against the plague, and also conclude on the effect of the plague on society. See you next week. Bye.